Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 116 of the Roundtable. Logos was unable to join us today due to some family stuff he was a part of. But we're still joined by Keith, Preston, and Florian to discuss the recent election upset with Donald Trump this year. So there's actually a lot to unpack here about the election and where to position it within a broader framework. But I think one of the first things I want to say is that this sort of what the Democrats have done with what I call the Obama cultural revolution, back when in his first term when he said he was going to have a radical alteration of America, and a lot of people didn't really believe him. Some far right people did, and they were considered conspiracy theorists. But then, and at the end of the second Obama term, we saw the woke starting to develop, and all of that stuff, and this sort of unleashing of chaotic forces, I think, sort of illustrates. It's a referendum on that whole cultural angle that was released. You could almost consider it a second 60s in the sense that this is the cultural explosion that upsets the status quo. And so I know, Keith, you like to go to the whole it's all the 70s again. So this could be seen as a Nixonian event where, law and order, Trump comes in and makes everything calm and stable again. But it really sort of highlights what the old conservative talk show host Michael Savage would say: liberalism is a mental disorder. It's this complete insanity, which was one portion of the Democratic Party, became dominant. And now we have Democrats talking about that now. Why did we let them take over and be the voice for all of us? And over the years, I've had some mea culpa from friends saying, yeah, you were right, Todd. Democrats were psychos. I always called the Democrats a suicidal self-mutilation death cult, because that's all they ever advocate is stuff like that. And nobody wants that, really. That's the thing. Nobody wants that. And so the question then is, what is the meta explanation for all this? Well, the reason why, and we've both talked about this before, Keith, a lot of the sort of like niche boutique issues that the Democrats just rushed into were in part the result of economic prosperity. These are issues that nobody cares about when, you have a hard time putting food on the table or gas for your car or a roof over your head. And so the fact that these issues don't seem to have as much traction, I argue, is in part due to the economic conditions. There was an excellent tweet from John Michael Greer on the 6th, where he says, "We're not yet to the point that the economic activity on average results in a loss rather than a profit. We are at the point, however, where falling net energy makes it impossible to support the vast superstructure of political, corporate, and nonprofit bureaucrats, managers, and flacks that are currently supported by what's left of our productive economic activity. That's the reason the entrepreneurs are rising to power. When Elon Musk laid off 80% of Twitter staff and improved service, he showed the wave of the future. The elimination of unproductive managerial jobs as a response to declining net energy. Of course, eventually net energy will drop low enough that the entrepreneurs won't be able to make money, but we're not there yet." So what I like about Greer's take is the energy in the system no longer allows for this. And the Democrats have just been living in fantasy land. And I've been arguing that on my channel since like forever. They always take the cultural issues that can be sustained on any given level of technological production and energy consumption. But the minute that slows down or trails off, you can't do that anymore because it's against reality. Reality will say, like, well, you're not really supposed to do that. You're doing this through some sort of elaborate roundabout hack. That's not going to work in the long run. And he's not quite saying this, but John Michael Greer is describing the mechanism by which this insight can happen. One reason why the woke became so dominant is because we live in the internet age, right? So Logos isn't here, but I'm sure he'd appreciate this take. Part of the problem is it's difficult to do things at scale. So if you're in business or politics and you want to hire people, well, you can't go through 10,000, applicants. That's just too much for you to do. So you find surrogates, you find things that you can look to as proxies. And of course, being successful on the internet and getting people to follow you and then signal boost you is a way to look like you represent a rising tide or trend. And so the woke understood the importance of the internet, and you could argue in some sense they were adapted to that environment. So they dominated it. But because it was only a proxy for real life, it didn't actually represent real life. And so a lot of people thought this was the trend that was coming, even though on the ground people were like, well, we don't support this. But then it further got muddied up because under, Jack Dorsey's Twitter, they suppressed and deleted all sorts of accounts. So it created even more of a bubble effect. And so it created this idea that, well, how can these people really, if they believe that and are so big and influential, it must be the case all around the world. And this is just the part of trusting in technology too much. It doesn't give you the kind of clarity about what's happening on the ground. You could sort of see this in Afghanistan in the GWAT, right? The Americans thought that something was going on the ground in a certain way, but it wasn't because their technology couldn't account for it. And in fact, it couldn't even pick up on it. So that data was just floating around in the ether somewhere that no one was reading. And you could see something like that happening here. But the danger here is that people believe this is a victory of conservative values or principles. This was the left's to lose. They had all the money. They had all the support. They had the system in their pocket. They fought Trump tooth and nail for his first term. They just totally screwed up. They just completely just screwed up. It was theirs to lose. Partly they didn't understand the energy situation, that we're in collapse and you can't reasonably do all this. The other thing, there was a referendum recently that there was in California, not that Gavin Newsom lost, but one of his minions lost to a conservative. I mean, who actually thinks it's cool that people just walk in and rob you of all your stuff? Apparently, progressive lawyers thought it was cool, so people throughout all these urban centers and blue states just had to have their property stolen. I mean, that should be obvious to anyone who wants to run as a political candidate that that's not a winning platform. But that's how the Democrats work. They live in this insane land. And part of what happened, though, now is the woke, because they had this resentment build up, use this as a kind of like revenge fantasy on the country. And because they were the first, there's what's called the Matthew principle, the first one in. They were the first one into using social media and the internet successfully. So that gave them a huge initial advantage. And they squandered it in this sort of like, petty revenge taking, which ultimately other intelligent internet savvy people rose to power and then confronted them and defeated them. And so there's that element too. But ultimately, what people need to be concerned about is this doesn't really change anything, right? We still have the demographic crisis, both in terms of lack of fertility and in terms of immigration. We still have the energy crisis, which, again, in my estimation, isn't the result of government regulations. At best, they're only slowing down or speeding up things. But in general, it's going to be a downward slope. And if the slope is downward, this is what we'd expect to see, what John Michael Greer calls the victory of the entrepreneurs. But that's not even a vindication of that mindset. It's just that they could see that the system would just be more efficient if they did it their way. And the real concern is that the gods bleed. Trump has shown that the elites can be stopped, the elites can be confronted, but that shouldn't be mistaken as the fact that Trump has the actual answer. These people are just so tone deaf and out of touch with reality that they open themselves up. I think what we should expect to see is other groups rise to the fore, both inside the Democratic Party and outside, that will continue to confront this and be more successful. And that may or may not look anything like Trump. Keith.
Well, I think there's a lot of different factors that converged in this election to make the outcome what it is. I tend to be more oriented towards macro level analysis and metapolitics. And I think looking at it from that kind of angle, there's a lot of interesting things that emerge. As Carl Oglesby said 50 years ago, the principal division in the American ruling class is between the traditional Northeastern establishment, the traditional elites, and between the Sun Belt elites that emerge in the post-war period with the rise of the military-industrial complex. And in the last half a century since Oglesby first advanced his thesis, we've seen more and more factions added to the ruling class, thanks largely to cultural changes and to demographic changes, and most importantly, technological and economic changes. So we've seen the rise of the tech oligarchs since that time. We've seen the rise of elites within traditional outgroups since that time. Also, we've seen a number of other cultural shifts that have made contemporary politics what it is. Another issue, I think, is partisan cycles. If we look at the history of partisan politics, Democrats and Republicans, going back over the last 120 years, what we see is that one party will be dominant for about 40 years, and then the other one will be dominant for about 40 years. And in any one 40-year period, the dominant party will have maybe 7 presidential terms. The other party will have maybe 3. All right, for instance, in the late 1880s to the late 1920s, the Republicans had 7 terms, the Democrats 3. Then from the late 1920s to the late 1960s, that was reversed. The Democrats had 7 terms and the Republicans 3. Then from the late 60s up until 2008, when Barack Obama was elected, the Republicans had 7 terms and the Democrats 3. So right now we're in the middle of another 40-year cycle in which so far the Democrats have been the dominant party. The Democrats have now had 3 terms and Republicans 1, and now the Republicans are getting a second one. And if this pattern continues, I don't know that there's any law of history that says that it has to, but if this pattern continues, that means the Democrats will probably continue to be the dominant party up through mid-century. And after this term, the Republicans will probably have 1 more, 2 if they're lucky. But right now we're in one of those mid-cycle shifts, and that certainly happens as well. For example, the Bill Clinton election in 1992, the Eisenhower election in 1952, the Woodrow Wilson election, whenever that was, 1912 or 16 or something. So we seem to be right now in one of those mid-cycle shifts, and so that's the meta level framework in which we're operating in as far as American politics. Now, one thing that was particularly significant about this election is the economic and partisan and cultural factors that were involved on the ground level. Most mainstream political scientists will tell you that an election is 2 things. It's a referendum on the economy, and it's a referendum on the incumbent party. Well, obviously, that both of those worked against the Democrats in this election. Nothing more needs to be said about that. Also, obviously, in the United States, we have this culture war going on, and as Todd was discussing, you had this surge of the cultural left during the Obama era, which kind of climaxed around 2020. And now we're seeing something of a pushback against that. I don't think that was a decisive factor in this election at all, but it certainly strengthened the Republican side and certainly motivated their base to come out for them, and probably helped them with some swing voters and moderates as well. So it certainly was a factor, the pushback against wokeism. But again, I don't think that was a decisive factor, but it was a factor. But more interesting than that, I think, is to look at the divisions within the ruling class that I was describing earlier and the shift that has taken place within the ruling class. For instance, I mentioned the Sun Belt rivalry with the Northeastern establishment. Over time, as Silicon Valley and the tech oligarchs generally have developed as a major ruling class faction, they've tended to be aligned with the Democrats. See people like Bill Gates and Zuckerberg and some others. Those are the more obvious ones. We've actually seen a fracturing of the tech oligarchy. Now that the tech oligarchy is becoming a larger and more influential ruling class faction, they started to fracture within themselves. And some are going over to the Republican side. And we've seen Peter Thiel do that. And we saw Elon Musk do that. If you want to know why Robert Kennedy backed Trump, you got to look at his financial backers. His running mate was a billionaire-ish Asian woman who used to be married to Sergey Brin, one of Elon Musk's partners. In fact, Elon Musk actually had an affair with Nicole Shanahan at one point. So you have these, this particular class of Silicon Valley weirdos going over to the Republican side, to counter the Silicon Valley weirdos on the Democratic side. So you've seen the shift among the tech oligarchs happen in this election. Also, you've seen within the investor class, there seems to be a fragmentation. From what I can gather, I'm not super plugged into the investment world, but from what I can gather, the value investors tended to favor Trump in this election, whereas the growth investors tended to favor Kamala Harris. For instance, if you look at the billionaires and millionaires who were supporting Harris, it was people like Mark Cuban. It's people that are oriented towards growth investment, development, entrepreneurialism, that kind of stuff. Whereas the ones who want to make sure the S&P and all that is thriving, those tended to lean more towards the Republicans. So you see this split within the investor class. Lastly, there's the influence of the Zionist elite. The Zionists over time have become an increasingly powerful and influential faction within the American ruling class and the Western ruling classes generally. And in the United States in particular, the Zionists are deeply embedded in all parties and all institutions, and they essentially control American foreign policy in the Middle East. And what I noticed after October 7th, 2023, the Hamas attack in Israel, is that among the Zionist elite, there was a shift. Whereas prior to that, you had a lot of liberal Zionists trying to work the liberal game and wokeism and all that. But then there seemed to be a rightward shift where it's all of a sudden they need to weaponize whatever they can against the pro-Palestine protests, against which mostly came from the left. So you started to see an effort by the Zionist faction of the ruling class to weaponize, various types of anti-wokeism, whether it's conservative anti-woke or liberal anti-woke like Barry Weiss and that kind of stuff, or whether it's obviously the Christian Zionists like John Hagee and people of that type, or these so-called cultural Christians that are basically atheists who hate Muslims, like Sam Harris, or I don't know, I'm not Sam Harris, maybe Dawkins or Ion Herzali and people like that. They were trying to bring all of that kind of stuff under the umbrella of pro-Zionism, anti-Semitism, or whatever. And so we've seen a rightward lurch by the Zionist elite on behalf of Israel. If we look at the funding that Trump has gotten, who were some of his biggest donors? One is Marian Adelson, right, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, a Jewish billionaire who made his money through casinos. All right, another one is Paul Singer. He's a big Jewish financier or whatever. Still another one is Bill Ackman. He's another Jewish financier that was behind a lot of the controversies involving campus protests. He was one that was pushing to get universities to remove college presidents that were not friendly to Israel enough. As Chuck Baldwin said at the time, Reverend Chuck Baldwin, who used to be a presidential candidate for the Constitution Party, said that one thing we learned from that incident is that Zionism trumps all the other isms. It trumps liberalism, wokeism, feminism, conservatism, evangelicalism, even when it comes to Ukraine, militarism, because the focus has shifted from Ukraine to Israel. So that we saw this rightward lurch by the Zionist elite. So all of these things, I think, strengthened the Trump campaign to the point where Trump had the value investors behind him. He had the Zionist elite behind him. He had the right wing of the tech oligarchy behind him, in addition to having popular sentiment behind him because of the state of the economy, because of the fact that the Democrats, incumbent president is a senile old man and his successor is an airhead, and also you had the pushback against the culture war. From the right end of the culture war, you had a pushback against the ascension of wokeness within recent years. So those created pretty good conditions for Trump to win, and he did. First time the Republicans have gotten a popular vote victory since 2004, only the second time since 1988. So they came out pretty well. Now, I think also we need to look at this in a world historical sense. This isn't just an American thing. If we look at the last 200 years in Western politics, we can see this constant push-pull between the left and right, or liberalism and conservatism, or progressives and reactionaries, whatever you want to call them, where whenever there's a certain push leftward, then that will be followed by a push rightward, and then there'll be another push leftward, and so forth. And we saw that, for example, in the early 19th century with the in the post-Napoleonic period, we saw the restoration of some of the monarchies. You saw it with the rise of authoritarian nationalism in the late 19th century with Bismarck. Obviously, fascism was one of these things. But right now, to understand what's happening in American politics, we also have to look at things that have happened in history, and then, like in the 19th century. Like in the 19th century, we had the rise of the Industrial Revolution, classical liberalism, modernity, free trade. We saw cultural liberalization in many ways. And we're seeing parallels to that now. Only this time, it's the digital capitalist revolution, not the industrial capitalist revolution. Just like we had free trade back then, now we have globalization. Just like we had the Enlightenment and modernity back then, now we've got the post '68 cultural revolution. I mean, 1968 was just a continuation of 1789, and we've got the post '68 cultural revolution, and then wokeness in recent years has been one of the expressions of that. And also, we see a lot of the cultural and economic changes. Just like in the 19th century, you saw a lot of traditional peasants, which are that is agriculturally based people, and freeholders and all of that, as well as artisans and craftsmen and those kinds of people were losing their livelihoods due to industrialization. And also, a lot of people like that saw their traditional culture being uprooted as well, thanks to the changes brought by the growth of commercial society and technology and all these kinds of things. And the exact same process is playing out, certainly in the Western world and even in many other parts of the world right now. And we're seeing the same kind of pushback, like who the Democrats represent today. If we look at who the Democrats represent, if we look at who the Labour Party of Britain represents, at who Macron's party in France represents, if we look at who Pierre Trudeau's party represents, it's basically the contemporary equivalent of the bourgeoisie of the 19th century. That is a middle class that is in ascendancy and replacing an older elite due to changes in the economy and changes in technology. They like Thomas Piketty calls it the Brahmin left, and that is or the tech oligarchs or the professional managerial class. This is the new bourgeoisie. These people are the modern version of the industrial bourgeoisie that came out of the 19th century. So they're becoming the new ruling class, replacing older things. And then if you look, and that's who the so-called left parties in the developed world are oriented towards. Now, if you look at who supports these populist nationalist movements that have emerged in recent years, whether it's Trump in America, or whether it's Brexit in Britain, or whether it's Le Pen, and the other one that starts with the Z in France, or whether it's Giorgia Meloni's party in Italy and other places like that, other people like that, and also in the global South and in the East as well. I mean, whether it's Putin, whether it's Jair Bolsonaro, whether it's Milei, whether it's the guy in the Philippines that was in recently. All of that represents the fact that people who see their livelihoods being lost or their culture being lost by these kinds of cultural, technological, demographic, and economic changes, they tend to veer towards those kinds of leaders. Just like in the 19th century, for example, you had a lot of the peasants and artisans and some petty bourgeoisie and people like that. They were the ones that were the constituencies for the throne and altar traditionalists, or they were the ones that were the constituents for people like Louis Napoleon III, which were basically a reaction against these rapid changes that happens. So it's everything that happened on Tuesday, November the 5th, is extremely understandable and even predictable. I'm not somebody who tries to predict the outcome of elections beforehand, but certainly the outcome should not surprise anybody, given this much larger metapolitical context in which it happened.
Okay, Florian.
Yeah, all good points. I'd like to add a little bit, and I'll also answer some of the points that you brought up. I think it makes most sense for me if I just put another position in there. I think the election is more in a realignment of the traditional left-right scheme, right? So we have now not the neocons against neoliberals. They have merged to like one blob anyway. We have more like a populist. Like, populism is more. We have more like elitism versus populism, more right. If I look at the right wing, they are adopting left wing positions in a very pragmatic way, rather than follow old paradigms. I'm just looking at what RFK Jr. brought in. He brought in not only a new aesthetic. If you still remember his pictures where he was showing himself on like a barbell, doing bench presses. It's now like and then he used that to lead into a more a more healthy culture that he wanted to promote, and he has people working for him and working with him, that are actually looking at things like seed oil in our food, and microplastics and all these kind of things, and also of course also looking at vaccination schedules. Like, it's easy to look at all the anti-vax people even without the whole COVID kerfuffle, but look at them, that people claim that vaccination causes autism, but it's not just like one vaccination. If you look at that, children get like a few dozen vaccinations within the first 3 years of life. That can't be good, and that's also more than I was getting as a baby, as someone who grew up in the 70s and 80s. So these, if you pump children full with like vaccines, you should at least think about whether that is something that may be potentially harmful to children, whether they really need all those many vaccinations. And that's what the whole campaign often was about. And then, yeah, as I said, seed oils and healthy food, um, uh, going against big agriculture, big pharma. These are all positions of the traditional left. These are basically Green Party positions that I remember from the 80s when I was like 10 years old. That was the Green Party in the beginning. And it seems like a sizable number of Republicans or people affiliated with Republicans have picked that up. And if you will, RFK Jr. has put and others have put those positions into the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is picking that up. And this is not the Republican Party of George W. Bush anymore, which was also pro corporation. This is not that party anymore. So I would say the divide is more pragmatic on the right versus ideological on the left, right? And then with the popular vote, it's interesting because I can share a screen here. Let me see. Yeah, if you tabulate the popular vote totals or the vote totals that Republicans and Democrats got over the last elections, let me see whether this works. I see. Maybe it doesn't work. I tried to share my screen. Does that
Okay,
work?
so,
Can you guys see?
Florian,
Yeah.
Florian, in the middle, you should see mute, stop cam, settings, present.
Yeah.
Yeah. So click on present.
Okay.
And then for present has share screen.
Okay. Let's see.
Unless you have slides, then you could just click slides.
No, I have. It's basically just on Excel, on an Excel file. Is that window entire screen? Entire screen. Let's see.
So you either go to window or you probably want to go to window, right?
Yeah, I think it just takes too long a little bit. So okay, I can just I should have practiced that before. Never mind. I don't want to like grind this whole to a halt. So I'll just explain what happens in terms of total votes. So basically, if you look at the total votes from 2000 to 2024 in all the national elections, then in 2000, both Democrat and Republicans had around like 50 million of votes each. Then in 2004, the Republicans under Bush gained a little bit over 60 million, and the Democrats stay slightly under 60 million. Then in Obama's election, Obama got 70 million, and Republicans stayed with 60 million. And so if you go forward, then the overall vote totals increased to then in 2016, when Trump was first elected, he still got less electoral votes than the Democrats, but he got more states, so he won in the electoral college. And then you have 2020, a huge spike for the Democrat vote. They got like 80 million, and then this has reduced down to 70 million. So basically, from 2016, the Democrats went from 65 million to 80 million to then down to 70 million. And the Republicans went from 2016, 62 million to 75 and 75. So it seems like there's a spike in the Democrat, and some people say, oh, that is evidence of fraud. And it may look that way if you only look at 2016, 2020, 2024. I'm not saying it's not evidence of fraud if you want to go that way, but it's also very similar. Joe Biden's election had very similar vote distribution as Obama's election had in 2008. And back then you can say, the prevailing narrative was that George W. Bush fucked up royally with Katrina and the Iraq War. So Democrats under Obama took all the votes. I'm not sure whether you can say Trump this time also fucked up royally, maybe with COVID, but it wasn't like, I don't see him as such a big villain as George W. Bush was seen, but it can be that drove Democrat turnouts. But there certainly are some shenanigans going on the local level. For example, right now, even though Trump carried Nevada, we see all of a sudden that the Democrat senator from Nevada won. Like all of a sudden there was a mail-in ballot dump, and then all of a sudden she goes from 10,000 votes behind to 2,000 votes in the lead and is then declared the winner. Make of that what you will, but it certainly is a very unusual observation. So the prevailing narrative on the Republican side is that this election was too big to steal, which may be true or may not be true. I'm just putting that out there, basically saying that the enthusiasm on the Republican side was so much larger than on the Democrat side that the Republican under Trump won. If you look at a map where you have I think New York Times had a map like that, where you have an arrow pointing at either a red arrow at the right or a blue arrow at the left, for people that in counties that voted more Republican than 2020, you see like a huge, basically like the entire United States is plastered with red arrows. So overall, in all states, almost all districts, almost all counties performed better for the Republicans than they did in 2020. That could mean the Republicans were more enthusiastic and had more turnout, or it could also mean that the Democrats simply stayed home, right? But I found that very interesting. Overall, it seems like almost a deafening red wave towards Trump as a Republican candidate. And I think New Jersey was never as close in previous elections as it was now, and so there really was a very strong movement. There's no doubt about that. The whole nation has become more Republican. From the demographics, interestingly enough, you have Hispanics that have like broken 50% pro-Trump, or 45 to 50%, which always voted for not more than 30% for Republicans. They broke massively. And together with the Gen X, those like aged between 45 and 65, those voted majority Trump, and which I would say is a support for my hypothesis, which is that we have a Republicans as the pragmatic electorate, and Gen X is a very pragmatic generation. Now, one thing I found very interesting is that so many Hispanic voted Republican, which seems to destroy sort of the Democrat hypothesis that you flood the country with illegal aliens, with immigrants, and they will all vote for you. Well, it turns out that probably after a certain time, when those immigrants have become legal, they don't want any more competition on the labor market for themselves. So that could explain why Hispanics voted overwhelmingly, much more so than in the past, for Trump. So the simple calculation that we just import our voters doesn't seem to work forever. It just seem to be more on the long run. It seems to also integrate itself into the trends that Keith outlined, right? With like a push pull between conservative and Republican, conservative and Democrats, left and right. And I think it's a good development, that you can't say, hey, we just import a lot of voters and now we get majorities here. And now that kind of like grifting grifting paradigm isn't possible anymore, right? Both for the Democrats, they can't import voters. That doesn't work forever. And for Republicans, they also can't say, hey, we are against illegal immigration. They have to really go, everyone has to really go and solve the actual problems at home, and not just say, we base our election propaganda on how many people the other side brings in. And interestingly, also there is Roe v. Wade was overturned, right, which brought the abortion issue back to the states. And interesting enough, you have these pro-life groups on the Republican side, and all of a sudden these groups are silent, or they say we can't vote for Trump because he didn't pledge to a complete abortion ban, which would be unconstitutional, because you also can't have a national murder ban, you know. But these groups, these pro-life groups, they didn't say a peep to people to support Florida's Proposition 4, I think it was. Florida's Proposition 4 led to was to ban abortions in the state of Florida. If you're pro-life, then you might want to get people riled up in Florida that they vote for that amendment, right? Because that is in your interest. But I think a lot of these groups, they're just grifting. They, like the anti-abortion groups, they want abortion legal because then they can raise money by arguing against it. And this kind of nonsense has also been put to rest. And I think that's another positive development of this election that isn't talked about enough, I think. And another thing, and that is basically connected to what I said earlier about immigration. Ramsey Paul had a video about that Texas is becoming redder. Many Republicans were proposing that Texas will be a blue state by 2024, 2028. No, Texas has become more Republican since 2016. So, right, another piece of evidence that immigration doesn't automatically lead to more blue votes, right? And it's really, once again, we can go away. We of course, it's important to close the borders. I think that's important. But there's also other issues that are plaguing us as a nation in that we should solve. And the whole immigration thing can sometimes be a distraction. So to get to Todd's point, Todd said something about California's insane policies to go soft on crime. That is true, but voters also approved Proposition 38 in California, which jacked up basically the fines for petty crime. So it's not possible anymore to just like get away with petty theft as long as it's not above 930 something of dollars. That the fines are now harder, and so that also means that the population of California doesn't fully agree with the blue government, right? So there are small counties where people rent up and back that proposition, and I think overwhelmingly they
Oh, we lost you, Florian. We can't hear you right now, Florian. Oh, let's see here. He doesn't. We can't hear him. Florian, can you hear us, Keith? Oh, you're muted too. Hold on, Keith.
I can hear you, Todd, but Florian apparently can't hear us. So
yeah, okay. I think we just have to kick him and hope he gets back in and we can hear him. I don't know what else to do. Oh, wow, that did not work. Okay. Remove from stage. All right. Now, yeah, he's still going on. We're going to have to just remove from stage and kick from studio. It just didn't work. Hopefully when he gets back in, it'll work. I want to read this super chat for $5 Death Culture. I'll catch the reply later, but thanks, Todd, guest co-host, for this channel, for the insightful content you guys put out. Well, you're welcome, and thank you for the support. Now let me just double check and hit up Florian on Facebook. All right. Well, let's hope Florian comes back. That was really weird. A couple of things here. This is actually, I'm glad Florian brought up immigration, because one thing that is a big potential pitfall that the Trump victory could lead people into is that they've defeated the immigration problem, because the Republicans and conservatives want to pitch it as a plot by the Democrats to have infinite votes. Okay, that's not the real reason why this is happening. The real reason why this is happening is the bourgeoisie wants to suppress the cost of labor. And the best way to do that is via immigration. Always has been, always will be. I mean, that's why they're doing this. Now, some Democrats were politically savvy enough to see that as a way to gain votes, sure. But if you beat them, you don't actually beat the process. The other reason why we want immigrants is they can't unionize. Engels mentioned even when even it was mostly European immigrants, different languages raised the unit cost of union organizing. There was an article on Reason magazine where they said that's how basically diversity defeated socialism. They were bragging about it, saying, yeah, that's how we beat socialism. And it's like, well, okay, it's right there. I mean, you don't need to talk anymore about that. The other thing then is, again, to reiterate this was the Democrats to lose. This was, okay, hold on. Does it work, Florian? Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, don't know what happened.
God damn it. How much did you miss? Everything?
No, not everything. Maybe like the last 3 minutes of you talking.
Okay. What was the last thing you heard me talking about?
Oh, wow. I don't remember. You talked about so much.
I talked about a lot, yes.
We're talking about immigration and how it's good that on one hand to control the borders, but we don't want to focus on that to the exclusion of everything else.
Yeah, that's basically that's perfectly summarized. I think, did I talk about abortion and pro-life groups not backing? Yeah. Basically, I think this to sum it. I think this election has also been the end to some of the grifters out there that, because a lot of these things are now solved more or less, and these grifters can't make money off it because they reached what they wanted to have, right? And now what for them? But it's good that we don't have those have to think about real topics as well, as Keith just said.
Right, and another point I was going to make was, the one thing I am happy to see is RFK and the health initiatives with things like vaccines and food and all of that. I haven't actually had the seed oil video yet, but people want me to do that. I haven't quite found a guest to do that with yet, but it's an important topic for me, so I am glad about that. The unfortunate thing, though, right, is, okay, so the pros probably going to have a detente with Russia, because that was what was, even in 2016, that was one of Trump's strongest selling points. But as you've mentioned, Keith, with the Israel lobby, and then prior to the stream, you mentioned an essay on Substack written by Academic Agent who argues in this direction. Once October the 7th happened last year, there was a pivot where all the Zionists got to get, pivoted away from the more boutique issues to just an Israel issue. And so, I mean, I don't know if you can have a GWAT 2.0, which would be a complete disaster, just like the first one, but it looks like they're trying to do that. So in this regard, Trump may not be great. Not that Kamala Harris would have been better on that issue either. neither one of them would have been very good. I mean, the pro-Palestinian protests on the left have been suppressed pretty hard lately by those on the left. So that's not really an issue. And we'll probably still have a conflict with China. I mean, after all, this pivot against China began with Trump, right? It was Obama here with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, yeah, which I think Trump has backed out of. But he's definitely had a more hawkish position on China. So it doesn't mean the end of wars. At best, it means we have one less war with Russia. Though the other thing that I wonder too, though, is that conflict in Ukraine wouldn't have happened under a second Trump term if he'd been elected in 2020. But because Biden was elected, the pressure was taken off Zelensky. So he went, accelerationist, started attacking all those Russian settlements in Lugansk and Donetsk, which then led to the Russian invasion. I almost wonder if World War III is on the menu, if it's too late to stop it. It's like, well, they've already got everything moving. Trump is going to probably not reduce tensions in the Middle East, even if he does in Europe. So maybe it's a balance. Maybe it cancels out. I don't know if the sort of like, if the deep state is as entrenched as it is and has already gotten the war going, it's difficult to envision Trump stopping it. Now, he might have been able to if he was elected in 2020, maybe, but I think now it might be too late. So yeah, we'll start with the final thoughts. We'll start with you, Keith.
Okay, well, a number of things. I talked about metapolitics last time, so I'll talk a little bit. I'll bring it down to earth a little more this time. Todd, you mentioned the elections in the 70s and 80s, like Nixon and Reagan. I do think this election was very similar to those. In fact, I remember when Biden took office, I remember thinking, I wonder if he's going to be Jimmy Carter. He's going to be an unpopular one-term Democrat that allows the Republicans to make a comeback. And after the Gaza protest started, I started wondering if maybe he was going to be another Lyndon Johnson as well. And it turned out he's basically both. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson was the president. He became unpopular because of his handling of the Vietnam War. And he consequently decided he was not going to run for re-election. And the Republicans under Nixon won in large part due to issues like concerns about law and order and a too sharp a turn, cultural turn to the left from their perspective. And then Nixon won re-election by a landslide in 1972. He won every state, 49 out of 50 states. The only state that voted against Nixon was Massachusetts and also Washington, D.C. That would be unthinkable now that a president wins 49 out of 50 states. But that happened in the 60s. And this election was somewhat similar, I think, to the 68 election. And also in 1980, it was a similar situation where you had a lot of people who felt that, they didn't just feel it. It was true that the economy was in very bad shape. They were very unhappy with the way the economy was going. Now, I actually think Jimmy Carter got blamed for a lot of things that weren't really his fault. I think a lot of that was actually Nixon. But Jimmy Carter was a one-term Democrat. It proved to be very unpopular, a very negative economic situation at the time, and that contributed to Ronald Reagan's victory. Also, there was also a perception at the time that things had moved a little too far leftward. For instance, Nima Parvini, academic agent, talks about how some people think the military has gotten too soft. We don't have enough people who are in good enough shape to be in the military. That was an issue back then. A lot of people thought Jimmy Carter had allowed the military to become too dysfunctional in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. So right now is sort of like the 1968 election and the 1980 election rolled into one. As far as the other cultural dynamics, I remember back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I started to notice the rise of political correctness. I started to notice how that had drifted from being a fringe cultural thing that you mostly found in academic circles and in activist circles, and it was starting to become more mainstream. And I started thinking, well, this is going to work its way into the political establishment and into the government and institutions eventually, and it did. That's what wokeism was. And I also around that time started noticing this populist right undercurrent that was very fringy at the time, but included a lot of stuff that you find among hardcore Trump followers today, like the anti-vaccination stuff or conspiracy theories and a lot of that kind of stuff. And I thought that would probably work its way into the mainstream as well, particularly as the wider culture in the United States drifted leftward. You'd see a pushback from the further right. And that happened, so a lot of the cultural dynamics that we see unfold in this election and or culmination of things that were going on, decades ago. That's certainly true. I also think that the demographics as destiny argument that the Democrats have used for a while is largely shown to be no longer valid. Now, I do think it was valid for a while, like back in the early 2000s. Rai Teixeira and John Judas published a book called The Emergent Democratic Majority. And this was a very influential book in Democratic circles, arguing that because of the demographic and cultural and generational changes that were taking, the Democrats would soon have a demographic majority. And that turned out to be right at the time. That's how Barack Obama got elected for 2 terms, was that theory was temporarily correct. But I remember back in the late 2000s, early 2010, somewhere there, Rick Perlstein, who's a liberal writer for The Nation magazine and publications like that, Rick Perlstein argued, well, this is not necessarily going to be a permanent Democratic majority. And he gave the past example of the white ethnics. He said, you have to remember that there were a lot of white ethnics that used to be reliable Democratic voters that eventually went over to the Republicans. And he gave, as examples, the Nixon voters, like the Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Polish Americans, et cetera, that voted for Nixon, and also Reagan. That was the Reagan Democrats were an important part of his coalition as well. And that seems to, and Perlstein was predicting that would happen with some other minority ethnic groups. And we saw that exactly in this election. Just breaking down the data, like I looked up the data about who the primary constituents were for the different candidates in this election. For Trump, it was white people, 57% of the white vote, 60% of white men, 53% of white females, 55% of Hispanic males. So they are basically the new white ethnics. Also, whites without a college degree, 50%, 56% of voters without a college degree. That gets back to some of the analysis I had earlier about groups that are in a state of socioeconomic decline. And older people, particularly middle-aged people, like people of my generation who are the Gen Z, late boomer people, people in the 45 to 65 range were the primary age group that went for Trump in this particular election. Whereas for Kamala Harris, Black voters still supported her by 85%, but that's actually down from what it used to be. It was typically about 93% or something. Black women, 91%, Hispanic women, 60%. So there's a big gender divide. There's also a big education divide. 55% of college-educated voters voted for Harris, as well as younger voters under 45, so young adults, early middle age. And women went for Harris by 53% overall, although white women didn't as a majority vote for Harris. So we see these this demographic breakdown, and that it's going to be interesting to see how things go in the future. Like whenever there's an election, the winning side always says, that shows that we have vanquished our opponents, here and forevermore. It never works that way. I remember conservatives saying that when Ronald Reagan was elected. I remember liberals saying that when Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were elected. For instance, in 2004, when George Bush was reelected, I remember a conservative newspaper columnist named Cal Thomas, who used to be a well-known pundit. It doesn't seem to be as well-known anymore. But Cal Thomas said at the time, well, this shows the 60s are over. We won this election. I'm like, wait a minute. You only won by a percentage point. The other side is half the country. And sure enough, 4 years later, this emerging democratic majority thesis, what one pundit called George McGovern's revenge, that came in 2008. So it's not that either side has fully vanquished the other side at all. It's in this particular term of Trump, turns out to be a massive screw up. Let's say we still have lots of inflation or something like that, or we get into an unpopular war. It could be the Republicans will be defeated in 2008. And like I said, right now we're in the middle of what patterns would indicate would be a mostly Democratic dominant cycle. So it could go either way. And I wouldn't begin to predict what Trump is going to do. Some of his ideas seem contradictory, and I think it's going to be dependent on who he surrounds himself with. For example, on Ukraine, I think it's going to be a matter of, is it going to be the traditional military-industrial complex, the neocons, the arms merchants? Are they going to get their way? They want to keep Ukraine going. It's very profitable. And a lot of them are, unreconstructed cold warriors. Or there's this other branch of the Republican Party that, sees, that's somewhat Russophilic. They see Russia as a conservative Christian nation, and they think there are some Zionists, I think, that want to bring U.S. foreign policy in line with that of Israel. And Israel is not part of the Western anti-Russian alliance. Israel works both angles at the same time, and 20% of Russia's population are Russian Jews. So you have that. You also see, I think, some realist strategists to see Russia as a potential ally against China. They want to lure Russia away from China. Whether that gets its way or not is I think more doubtful. But I think that's really the big wild card. What's Trump going to do with regard to Israel? I think it's obvious that Trump's going to be 100% pro-Israel in the current war. What efforts he makes to put it into it or rein it in, who knows? But Israel seems to be collapsing itself, so that may be a factor. But I think the big issue is that the Trump administration is probably going to continue the trade war with China. That seems to be a pan-ruling class consensus among elites that China is the number one rival and that they need to up the trade war with China. So I think that's probably going to be the most predictable geopolitical outcome.
All right, Florian, final thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting next 4 years, especially with the more of the pragmatic side of Republican politics, pro-health policies. There's also lots of talent on the ground. Like, for example, in Pennsylvania, someone with the name of Scott Presler, who basically was already around 2016, but he had all this, he championed all the get out of the vote efforts for the Republicans. So that's I would say people like that are generational talent that is now getting into the Republican Party. Also, when Keith said whites without college degree vote Republican, I think without college may all actually nowadays not necessarily mean less educated. It means just with a different type of education, right? We have like people, for example, you don't need to study computer science anymore if you want to start a if you want to go into cybersecurity, for example, you can get by just getting the like 4 or 5 licenses that you need, and then just like be very crafty in applying everywhere and showing a little bit of experience. But you don't need to go through the college route, study computer science for 4 years anymore to get there. So those people would also be non-college educated, but those people are far away from uneducated, right? And what's more, those people together with Hispanic working class people, they may find an especial alignment with people like J.D. Vance, right? So it could definitely be that this is not, as some people said, the last election for Republican. Afterwards, everything will be Democrats. No, I mean J.D. Vance has good chances to continue to become president in 2028, right? And then maybe go another 8 years. So that's interesting to observe. One thing I want to say, as excited I am about pro-health policies, I remember, or I read that in the 1960s, they had several physical fitness program American schools. One of the most well known of this was the Sierra High School program. Sierra was a school in California, and they had basically a whole roster of fitness challenges students had to go pass through, and then they were allowed to wear red trousers or red sports trousers, and then if they made it through that, they could wear blue trousers, and then they could wear blue with the gold. And the blue with gold was like the top level, very difficult to get. You had to swim a certain amount, like under a certain time. That is not easy to get, but some got it. And these pro physical fitness programs, and I think the Kennedy generation, especially the Kennedy family and others back then, were very big on physical fitness. And then there was the Vietnam War, and I think one reason why these fitness programs were stopped or fizzled out was that, if you're 18 years old or 16 years old and you see your friends get shipped off to Vietnam, you don't really want to prove that you're in your best constitution physically, right? Like, get the blue trousers with the golden bandage, and then you get shipped off to Vietnam. No, thank you, right? And that discredited the whole fitness drive. Now, I could see something similar happening if now the Republican Party becomes the champion of physical health, fitness, and all that, and then we're involved in more wars in the end. People may also say, I don't want to be fit enough to be a soldier. No, thank you. I'll do my own stuff. I'm not interested in fitness anymore, right? So that could also be an unforeseen effect of having too many wars. But on the other hand, from Trump's first term, at least he didn't start any new wars, and he more or less like ended wars, or turned them down from full stage military involvement to more specific operations. And so I expect there probably will not be many wars in Trump's next term. We didn't talk much about that, but I think Trump will wind down like both Ukraine and both Israel Palestine war in some form or another. Looking at his first term, I just can't see him as someone who escalates military tensions. At least it may be that those conflicts will still move along, but there's no. He doesn't have like this neocon Yahoo, let's go to more wars. At least that's not the branding he goes under, right? So I expect the next 4 years to be relatively more peaceful than the last 4 years.
All right. Just before I wrap up, one of our chat members of Mass Creation Broadcast will have a show tomorrow. He's going to drop about the election as well. So just type in his name in YouTube, Mass Creation Broadcast, and you guys should be able to see that. But yeah, thanks, Keith. Thanks, Florian. It's always a pleasure. We missed Logos, but he had some family stuff going on. So this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast signing off.